We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
As the United States pulls out of major international treaties and organizations, is multilateralism under threat? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. During the United Nations General Assembly, world leaders gathered in New York to trumpet their commitments to the multilateral system. Almost all leaders, except one. US President Donald Trump took to the UN stage to tout his policy of nationalism. During a high-level week of speeches at the United Nations, I sat down with Stephane Dujarric. He's the spokesperson for the UN Secretary General. I started by asking him about the effectiveness of the United Nations in the face of increased criticism and protectionism.
Well, I think it's not about one person or one president. We're seeing the world over questioning of multilateralism, attacks on multilateralism. And as the Secretary General said it's really a crisis of trust. People are doubting institutions at the global level, at the national, at the local level. And we need to rebuild that trust. The United Nations is an organization of 193 member states, and it's really only as strong as the collective will of the member states wants it to be in dealing with global problems. And so I think the Secretary General and the Secretariat have its parts to play, but member states themselves have to come together and understand, and I think the vast majority of them do, that the only way to tackle the problems that we're seeing in the world today, whether it's the climate change, whether it's health pandemics, whether it's migrants and refugees on the move, is through global solutions, all the while respecting the sovereignty of each of our 193 member states.
But when you hear the kind of sentiments that Donald Trump made in the General Assembly Hall here, how do you see that? Do you see it as a big setback for the organization, or is it just a bump in the road?
Look, every year member states and leaders come and address the General Assembly. Often those messages are delivered for their home audience. As for the United States, it is a founding member of this organization, a critical partner, the largest funder in terms of assessed contributions. The Secretary General, I think, has a very productive and very workmanlike relationship with the President of the United States and with the U.S. Each member state is going to enact the policies that it does. But overall, we have I think the Secretary General has a very constructive relationship with the U.S. But as I said, this challenge to global diplomacy is really coming from many different quarters, and is one where the UN itself, the Secretary General, has a role to play in ensuring that the organization that he leads, the Secretariat, is as effective as it can be in delivering on the needs of people.
One of the most successful examples of multilateralism was the Iran nuclear deal, which was completed under the auspices of the United Nations. Then we had the United States pull out of that deal. How much of a blow was that to the UN?
Well, for the Secretary General, you know, and if I may correct you, the deal was signed outside of the UN with the Europeans and the Americans and the Iranians. It then came to the Security Council. The Security Council voted and approved it. The UN, through the International Atomic Agency, has certain responsibilities. The Secretary General, who is not a party to negotiation, however, views that the JCPOA as a critical victory for diplomacy, also against nuclear proliferation. And he believes that we should do whatever we can to support the agreement and ensures that it survives.
What are the priorities for the Secretary General for this General Assembly 2018? I think
if you were to ask him what keeps him up at night, I think he would say it's climate change. And the fact that he fears reaching possibly a point of no return unless countries live up to the commitments they've made in Paris. You know, if you look at some of the horrible crises we're dealing, whether it's conflict, whether it's health pandemic, refugee crisis, these are things that can actually, at some point, be solved through political will. If we don't show the political will to tackle climate change, at some point, none of us will be able to do anything about it. It's beyond, it's Mother Nature in a sense, and you don't negotiate with Mother Nature. So he's really trying to focus people's attention on that in the longer term. There's so many things that need our attention in the short and medium term that we really also can't lose what is in the longer term and is a existential threat to us.
And here again, it was the United States that pulled out of the deal, the Paris Accord. Can it survive without the United States?
Well, I think if you look at the United States and other countries, you will see that, in effect, the business sector and local subnational governments are very much committed to meeting targets. And we do think that even with the government, federal government having taken the position that it has, we're very much engaged with the business sector, and we think that those targets can still be met.
Let's look at some of the regional challenges that you face right now. Let's look at the Middle East, for instance. The United States has slashed $360 million from the budget of the UN Relief and Works Agency. It's an agency that's been there for a very long time. It helps the Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem as well. What impact will that have on the work of the agency?
It's, UNRWA is at a critical point. It is in need of about $186 million, where we've raised over $200 million. UNRWA plays a stabilizing role in the region in feeding a large number of Palestinians, educating them. UNRWA is not responsible for finding political solutions. The political parties involved need to talk and find that solution. For the Secretary General, ultimately, it's a two-state solution. But we are in critical needs of funds for UNRWA currently.
Another big crisis the world is facing right now, refugees. We see it in many parts of the world right now, in Europe, in Yemen, in Syria, in Myanmar, in Latin America as well. What is the UN doing?
Well, one way to stop the movement of people who are fleeing conflict is to stop those conflicts, right? And we, through the Secretary General's envoy on Syria, on Yemen, to name just two, are hard at work trying to push the parties, push and pull the parties, I would say, to the table to find that political solution. In the meantime, we are continuing with our massive humanitarian work, both inside Syria, inside Yemen, often at great personal cost to humanitarian workers, most of whom are either Syrian or Yemenis, and supporting the countries that have generously hosted the vast majority of refugees, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, ensuring that those countries have the assistance they need to help the refugees.
Something like combating the refugee crisis obviously requires enormous resources. Are you getting it?
Our resources, our humanitarian appeals are unfortunately critically underfunded, but we have no choice. And if you were to look at a kind of a short-term solution and self-interest, it is in the interest, we would say, of some of the more developed countries to help the refugees and to ensure that they don't get cut in food, in all sorts of aid, so that they don't leave the countries where they are, their bordering countries. Because we saw that a couple of years ago. World Food Program had to slash the food rations of refugees built in Turkey and Lebanon, and that may have been the cause of some of the flows we saw to Europe.
Now, one of the other big functions, of course, of the United Nations is peacekeeping. You have several peacekeeping missions around the world. The United States has made it very clear. It contributes 25% of the peacekeeping budget, but it says it's not going to go over that. Is that a problem for you?
The bigger problem with peacekeeping operations is the fact that often the mandates that we are given by the Security Council are not adapted to the solution, to the places where we work. Traditionally, peacekeeping was there to help cement a peace between two parties. And we still have some of those traditional missions, but we're seeing in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Mali, in the Central African Republic, peacekeeping missions that are really doing counterterrorism work, right? That are fighting armed militias with which you can't always negotiate. And so we don't often have the troops that we need, with the equipment that we need, and the training we need. So it needs to improve our peacekeeping effectiveness, it needs to be a partnership between the Security Council, the Secretariat that manages the mission, and those countries that give the troops. And we need to ensure the troops are well trained and well equipped.
One other question, and this is a perennial question, you probably get asked this every year, and that is expansion of the number of permanent members on the UN Security Council.
Indeed, it is a perennial question. I think this is a question that is firmly in the hands of the member states. It is up to them to decide on the reform of the Security Council. From the Secretary General's standpoint, it's clear that there needs to be reform, that the Council now is more of a reflection of the world as it was in 1945 as opposed to 2018. And the credibility of the Council really rests on its representation. And that's why the reform is so important.